With the road entry point management systems in regional governance, there comes a time now when the different countries are competing with each other. In the presentation, we'll be discussing distinctions between, for example, Euro and North American values and African values. Because in the Westernized system, there's more of a focus on individuality and survival of the fittest, where in the African frame of reference, there's more of a focus on collectivity. There's more of a focus on duty than on rights. We have been busy discarding our African values. People in Westernized countries have been taking them up and finding out how they can better support each other. Any type of democracy needs civil society organizations to function. Thank you for being here. We thank the APRM for inviting us. We congratulate the APRM team on all that they have been doing, as well as all the work that the African Union has been doing in order to help us envision our futures. And I really appreciate this sister here that just gave her presentation, because she definitely laid the groundwork for us in terms of diverse ways of knowing. Because we're going to talk to you today about the intersectionality of regional governance and cross-national activities in Southern Africa, about the role of African epistemologies. My challenge is going to be to stay in one spot, because I'm the kind of person that's used to moving around, but I'm going to try. If I move too much, just wave and I'll come back, okay? As far as our bios, both our bios are in the program, so feel free to read about us. Okay. So now, regional governance and cross-border activities in Africa. Here we're talking about movement of people and goods on the ground. So how many people have traveled from one African country to another on the ground? Okay, did you have to go through border control? Yeah. Did you have to go through road entry point management systems? Yeah, well, this is what we're going to be talking to you about today. And as you see, my colleague is going to share results from a study about this and what the respondents have to say about how things are. And then we're going to envision, actually, they've already told us, how things would be if we were to incorporate African ways of knowing into how the border systems work. So we're using that as a practical example of incorporating African epistemologies into governance to spur regional governance in an African way. All right, so now first I'm just going to make a few distinctions about African epistemologies and Euro-North American epistemologies. But before I do that, I want to say epistemologies are not racialized. All right, so this is not about black, white, green, blue, polka dot. This is about how people view the world in terms of their daily existence and their interaction with each other. And there are certain values that have been attributed to African ways of knowing, and certain values that are attributed to, let's say, Euro, North American ways of knowing or ways of viewing the world. In terms of international relations, we are all familiar with the narrative about the continent being marginalized, about the Berlin Conference, the scramble of Africa. We know all about the fact that these borders were arbitrarily drawn in terms of how the colonizers decided. Every time I say that, I think about the Black Panther movement, right? About how they were drawing a group of people, and one ethnic group could end up on different sides of the border. So we understand how all that happened. And also, as time went on, from the Westphalian moment or the Westphalian Conference, when this whole nation state idea came into being, that at that point, African countries were being exploited, being colonized, were not included as this international system of states expanded. We were not at the table. Even as it went forward, and there would be meetings at heads of state in the US, there's a well-known traditional leader from the first world, Native American, who showed up with the heads of state and was turned away, because even though he was in charge of an Indian, so-called Indian or Native American nation, he wasn't recognized as being part of being a head of state. So this is the kind of discourse that's coming in terms of international relations. And also the fact that once independence came about for African countries, we either decided or it was imposed upon us to take on a lot of the values that I'm going to talk about next. So before we get to the values, let's just take a minute and distinguish between ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodologies. They sound fancy, but they're very simple. Let's go to the westernized part first. From a westernized standpoint, there is a distinction between ontology and epistemology. Ontology is considered to be how a person understands reality. For example, you've heard that saying about if a tree falls in the forest and there are no human beings around, does it make a sound? Now, your answer to that says a lot about your epistemology and whether or not, from an anthropological standpoint, you have to have a human being in order for nature to be able to be the way it is. In terms of epistemology, that's about what constitutes knowledge. How is it constructed? How is it disseminated? And who decides how it was going to be devised? Now, we know that story because there are volumes of books and articles about the fact that the African continent was uncivilized, did not know what they were doing with themselves, were unruly, and as the narrative goes on in that respect. But very little attention is paid to what was happening in a pre-colonial standpoint, which is what we're going to talk a little bit more about. In terms of, from an African epistemological stance, there's no division between, see, here I go. There's no division between any of these. You know why? Because in the African epistemologies, things are looked at holistically. Things are looked at in terms of being integrated. So there's no distinction between ontology and epistemology. There's no distinction between how you see reality and how you understand knowledge and the construction of knowledge. In terms of axiology, I'm going to show you another slide about that distinguishes values. And as far as methodologies, the example that we're going to be using shows you how methodologies can help you tease out where we stand in terms of which epistemologies are present where governance is concerned. So now, let's look at some of the distinctions between westernized and Africanized value. And we've discussed these today a lot in terms of competition that goes along with mercantilism, capitalism, neoliberalism, and things of that nature, as opposed to the African values of cooperation, some of which we have forgotten, but hopefully we can remember and see how it can help us with regional governance. Individuality, individual rights, for example, whereas for Africans, it was more of a groupness or a communalism type of reference. Now, mind you, when you see these, on the Africanized side, I'm talking pre-colonial. Some of this may exist now, some of it, well, we know in a lot of places it doesn't exist now. Instead, we have taken on a lot of the westernized values, and westernized countries, westernized people have taken on a lot of the Africanized values. So that's why it's important to understand that this has nothing to do with race, but it's how people perceive and function in the world. For example, the spiritual context is a central component of African values. Whereas for westernized values, there's more of a focus on materiality, and there's a separation, a strict separation between church and state. Whereas the spirituality on the African side is not about religion. It's more so about, for example, the relationship that a family might have with their ancestral lineage. Now, you see all these websites showing up now about trace your genealogy, and you can find out who your ancestors are. Well, in African society, particularly pre-colonial African society, that was never a question. There was an oral tradition that kept the family united, that kept the family aware of who they are and what their legacy is. I'm sure you saw the movie, The Roots, and how Alex Haley was able to trace back and find out the person who could give the oral testimony about how he was sold, his family was sold into slavery. So in addition to that, you hear a lot about, for example, what's that guy's name? Tyler, the medium to the stars. How many people have heard that sitcom or television show? You know the show I'm talking about? Come on, people, talk to me. Have you heard of that? Okay. Have you heard about Teresa, the one in Long Island that talks to the dead? That's also on TV. So all these mediums have become big things. And people are talking about, wow, isn't this sensational? They can communicate with the spirit world. Well, guess what? We did that from day one. But now we act like it's taboo. Now we want to hide it. And even those who might decide that they want to adopt various westernized religions, by the way, which were originated in Africa, that's a story for another day, they still will go to the medium to get guidance on what's happening in their lives. So survival of the fittest, survival of the collective, you understand the distinctions there. And it's very interesting now when you hear all this talk about, oh, now Africans must learn how to conserve nature. Really? Have we not been working with nature from day one? Have we not been one with nature from the beginning? So we really need to rethink how we are thinking and what our state of being is in terms of understanding African epistemologies and westernized epistemologies. So now, how did this demise of African ways of knowing come about? Well, of course, there are a wide variety of reasons, including what we have done to ourselves. We know we sold ourselves into slavery. We're well aware of that, and we're often told that, well, you did it. I don't know why you're complaining about the slave trade. You sold these people to us. But we also must recognize that the African understanding of slavery did not mean lynching a man by hanging him for the tree and relieving him of some central body parts. That was not part of the type of slavery when there was a war between two ethnic groups and one family became a member of a different family. So the African epistemology of slavery was different from that of the slave traders. And these examples can be recounted and recanted over and over again. We also have an undeniable openness to give up our values in favor of whatever it seems is popular at the time. These are decisions that we have made. There's no one to blame for this. We make decisions about whether or not we are going to uphold and practice our values, or whether we are going to take on the values of others because it's fashionable, or as an earlier presenter said, the self-enrichment can happen, the self-aggrandizement can happen through the development of classes, so that certain classes have more money and are able to do certain things. We are making those decisions to come away from our African values and instead take on other values. The willing to diminish interdependence of African countries and regions. I suggest you read Chancellor Williams about the destruction of Black civilization, and also Diop and the cultural unity of Black Africa, where they really talk about how from one end of the continent to the other, there were already regions or networks. There was constitutionalism. There was democracy. And you know what kind of democracy it was? Consensus democracy. How many African countries have consensus democracy? But the European countries have taken on consensus democracy, like the Netherlands, like some of the Nordic countries. The very things we invent, they take and make use of for themselves. I don't know how long we're going to keep doing this. So the thing is to be aware of our history and what we have initiated, it's like the constructions of geopolitical areas. Now, we all know if we look on the map, there's no continent that's holding the Middle East, really. And the Middle East, it's middle to who and east of who? You know, think about these constructions, because the last time I looked at the map, Egypt was in Africa. So we are allowing this to happen because we have made decisions to set aside our own history, our own legacy, our own values, where other people take them and make use of them as if it was their idea. And then the reluctance to be guided by African ways of knowing. We've bought in. They told us we don't know anything. We believe it. They told us that we're backwards, that our cultures and customs must stop because they're primitive. We believed it. How long are we going to believe what external actors are telling us about ourselves instead of preparing for futures that our colleague has told us about that can determine what the narrative of Africa is going to be by Africans, not in the media? Okay, all right. Currently, I'm with the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I've been there since 2011. The University of KwaZulu-Natal, it's known as a research-led university, and we focus on research, we focus on teaching, as well as community engagement. And the idea is to be innovative and strive for excellence in all three of those pillars. In addition to that, in terms of what I do to carry out those mandates, of course, I develop a lot of curriculum, especially curriculum related to transformation and Africanization of education. As a researcher, I have to produce scholarship. I supervise quite a number of master's and doctoral students. And in addition to that, I engage with the community in a variety of ways, including the time I'm spending here now. This, too, is community engagement. My topic is on the role of African indigenous knowledge in what we call road entry point management system. So these systems have been studied. This is a study that I'm reporting on together with a colleague. And then we're showing how the respondents are, the very things that they're complaining about are the things that are a result of westernized ways of knowing. But what it has to do with is how people see the world and what their values are. So in the presentation, we'll be discussing distinctions between, for example, Euro and North American values and African values. Because in the westernized system, there's more of a focus on individuality and survival of the fittest. Where in the African frame of reference, there's more of a focus on collectivity. There's more of a focus on duty than on rights. At least there used to be. That, in some ways, the African values have been discarded, and westernization has taken over the way a lot of us think. But before, with African values, I can give you a really good example everybody knows about. If they get a job, then they're expected to support their family or give to those, I think they call it a black tax or something like that. That's part of that collective mindset that, you're supposed to support each other. So I'm not giving a pro or con on that example, but I'm saying that in the African psyche, there is something there about taking care of your own and having a duty and a responsibility, as opposed to all this entitlement about I, me, and mine, and these types of rights assertions. So there's a lot of different examples that we'll be bringing out in the presentation, and then we structure those to then talk about how, with the road entry point management systems in regional governance, there comes a time now when the different countries countries are competing with each other. In a westernized sense, there's more of an individualization and state sovereignty that's important to the countries, as opposed to them becoming interdependent and seeing how the systems at the different borders can be interdependent. We're all African people. Why are we making it difficult for business to take place, or making it difficult for people to cross borders? And in addition to that, the borders are all artificial, because those borders were drawn during the Scramble of Africa and the Berlin Conference. So you may have one ethnic group on this side of the border and another ethnic group on that side of the border. But because we've taken on this westernized stance, we're making all these divisions instead of looking at the cooperation, the harmonization, all these things that are part of ancient African values. We have been busy discarding our African values. People in westernized countries have been taking them up and finding out how they can better support each other. Now there's this big thing with network governance, and how different, and how government has to partner with all these multi-sector agencies. This network governance was part and parcel of pre-colonial Africa. But people don't think about that because they might not even know about that. So these are the types of things that we bring out with African epistemology. For one thing, I think it's fantastic that this seminar is happening, because that would be one of my recommendations, for there to be forums of discourse that bring together academia, that bring together practitioners in governance, especially at the continental level, but also bring in civil society organizations, because any type of democracy needs civil society organizations to function. That being said, another recommendation is that I think the APRM and the AU can get more involved on undertaking research that is going to help us understand things from the standpoint of African ways of knowing. For example, in westernized ways of knowing, things like ontology, epistemology, axiology, that's just a fancy word for values, and methodologies, all those things are seen as separate. But in the African way of looking at that, all those things are interconnected. But you need certain research methodologies in order to be able to carry out such a study. You can't just import how other countries are conducting their studies. So I think with the APRM and the AU becoming more involved in a focus on African epistemologies, and when I say that, I'm including the ontologies, I'm including the values, I'm including the research methods, because we have a tendency to look at things holistically and in an integrated fashion. So I think undertaking research, and also, as we have already been discussing in the forum, capacitating the staff so they can even better undertake the research or be a part of research teams or lead research teams. Because we can't just sit in a room and make up things, and which academia is famous for theorizing. But since APRM is on the front line in terms of being practitioners, I think that bringing those two together along with civil society can help improve good governance, but we may even need to define what is that really, because one of the presenters was just making the point about the origin of the whole term of good governance. So we may even want to call it something else, but it has to be something that works for African countries, and not instilling the same thing that we create a mandate and say all African countries must do this, but to conduct research and find out what works best in different African countries, and then to improve and enhance that, which will also help us create a whole new generation of scholars who are not just doing things according to westernized ways of thinking. When I can give you an example of Sustainable Development Goal 16 that deals with access to justice, that also deals with institutional development and being inclusive. So in my opinion, there are a lot of different avenues that we can pursue for that, but we can't just leave it to the rule of law. Because you'll find in African countries that there are plural justice systems. It's not just about getting an attorney and going to court. There are community advice offices, for example, that are run by community-based paralegals in a lot of African countries. And what happens there is those CAOs need further institutional development and recognition. They're very different from lawyer-led legal aid, for example, because these community-based paralegals don't just think about the rule of law, but they also think about African culture. And they also work in tandem with the institution of traditional leadership. So for example, I've been doing some research on this, and there was a client who was trying to get her granddaughter returned to her from the paternal family. And from the maternal family. The child was in the custody of the paternal family. And, you know, the grandfather in the maternal family made it clear that pregnancy damages have to be ordered. They have to be in order. There are certain rituals or customs that have to be followed when a woman does not leave her home in the way that it's intended from a cultural standpoint. So these damages could take the place of monetary damages. It could take the place of cows or livestock being gifted to the family. It could take the place of slaughterings occurring. But what's really going on here is not just the human level, which is very important about governance in the African frame of reference or in the African ways of knowing.